Good morning and welcome to today's panel, Regional Hotspots and Global Interventions. We have a really exceptional panel here this morning of really scholar practitioners, those who are clearly experts in the field. I'm sure everybody here and listening online have read their works, but also four scholars who have spent a lot of time actually on the ground in the field. And today is particularly significant. In fact, the purpose of today's event really is to launch Nate Rosenblatt's paper, The Architects of Salvation, which is online at the moment, and he'll be referring to that paper today. What I thought I'd do is I'd just start by introducing you to the panelists. As I said, we have Nate Rosenblatt from New America International Security Program, and he's a doctoral researcher at Oxford University. We have Dr. Jessica Darden, Assistant Professor at American University School of International Service. Dr. Aaron Zellin from who's a Richard Borrow Fellow at the Washington Institute, and of course Asad Al-Mohammed, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Program on Extremism. Now, before I start, I think it's also important for me to kind of plug some publications by these by the speakers today. As I said before, Nate's paper, it's out today. Please have a look at it. The Architects of Salvation. It was based on field research in Tunisia, exploring, analysing ISIS recruitment hubs. Jessica has a paper I noticed last night, was published with The Hill. And also, the AEI publication.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. Oh, and The Hill as well. Are we plugging that one? Yeah, there's just too many publications to mention here, you know. And of course, Aaron's book that has been released, Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihadi, which you will refer to today, but also have a bit more of a broader discussion as he and Asad are going to kind of work off each other to kind of bring this discussion out into a more global perspective. And of course, do read Asad's 7 Years of Terror, Jihadi Organizations, Strategies and Future Directions, which is being published with the ICCT only a couple of weeks ago. So let's start with the keynote for today. The soon-to-be Dr. Nate Rosenblatt.
I hope. Thanks a lot, Aurora, for that introduction and those plugs. That was a good series of plugs. The Architects of Salvation is a great title. It's unfortunately not my turn of phrase. It's by an author named Yasmina Khadra. It's a fictional take on the Algerian uprising in the 90s. It's called Wolf Dreams. I highly, highly recommend it. And I read that book, and a lot of the things that he talked about in the ways that people were recruited particularly in Algiers, resonated a lot with what I saw in Tunis this summer. Before I jump in, I just want to thank you all for coming. Sometimes people get a little bit nervous when there's not a large crowd, but actually I think it's great because it gives us a chance to actually interact with each other in a more substantive way. So I'll just keep my remarks fairly short, referencing a few parts of the paper that I think are interesting. I'll just open with a story about one of the people who I interviewed in this neighborhood of Tunis where I was doing my field work. The neighborhood's anonymized in the paper. My fieldwork there is ongoing, but we'll just call it the hub, let's say. And so I interviewed this guy, Mustafa, in the hub, and I'll tell you a little bit about how he tried to get to Syria to join IS. And then I'll end by just giving you 3 takeaways from, I think, the lessons I get from his story. There are many others. So when I met him this summer, I asked him, okay, so how, I knew he had tried to go. That was how he was introduced to me from a friend of mine. And I asked him, okay, so if you wanted to go, not necessarily that this is your story, but if you wanted to go, how would you do it? And so he was describing a period during Tunisia's history. It was 2013. So there was a lot of state pressure on Ansar Sharia at the time. Ansar Sharia as an organization was designated a terrorist organization in August. But at the beginning of the year, I interviewed the Interior Minister at the time who said we basically consider them a terrorist organization by the start of 2013. And So there's a lot of pressure on the organization. It started to go underground. It wasn't really much of a social movement anymore. It was much more of an underground militant organization at the time. But there was also a lot of pressure on Mustafa. His father and his brother had already joined IS in Syria, and he would communicate with them via WhatsApp, and his brother basically cut off ties with him a few months before the start of 2013, basically calling him a disbeliever and telling him if he was serious, he would come and join the fight in Syria. They joined us, they switched to IS once it was formed in April. And basically, by the start of 2013, because of the state pressure on Sharia, also some of the investigations on people who were involved, it was actually harder to get to Syria than we sort of think. And so you really needed help to get there. I mean, once you had help, it was fairly straightforward, but you needed the help. So the question was first, for Mustafa, because he had decided to go, was how could he get the help he needed to get to Syria? And so he described to me, firstly, that you had to go to a mosque in your neighborhood. Ansar al-Sharia by this point had taken over virtually every mosque in the neighborhood. For this story about how they did that, I refer you to the paper. It's a great story, though. It involves the Tunisian version of WikiLeaks. It's very crazy. So you'd go to the mosque and you would just show up every day. You couldn't just show up and say, I want to go to Syria. You would just show up every day for many days. Eventually, people would notice you and would start checking your references. They would ask around in the community, do you know Mustafa? What do you think of him? Is he honest? Is he trustworthy, etc.? And if you checked out, one day after prayers, they would ask you to stay behind, and you would start talking, and over time they would put you through a series of commitment tests, essentially. You would have to study a very rigorous curriculum put together by Khatib al-Idrisi, and Aaron can talk a little bit about Khatib al-Idrisi. But Mustafa was explaining some of the things they had to read, and some of the lectures they had to attend, but the real key for them was you had to participate. You had to participate in groups activities all the time to show you were committed. You had to change your style of dress, you had to change your manner and behavior, you had to change the way you spoke to people. All of those transformations, both personal and interpersonal, were part of your transformation as a show of commitment to the group, and people would compete over these demonstrations of commitment in the way that many people would sort of compete for a job promotion. And over time, without really realizing it, I think Mustafa became radicalized and indoctrinated into this ideology. But for him, a lot of this seemed really normal. The final test was he had to raise 2,000 Tunisian dinars, which was like, I think $700 or so. And that was really hard. I mean, Mustafa came from a very, very poor neighborhood. Work didn't pay well if you could get it. So some people, he was saying, they couldn't raise the money. So eventually the leaders of the group, Kamal Zarrouk and others in the neighborhood, passed a fatwa saying, it was permissible to steal if it meant you were going to the money would take you to jihad. So those 2,000 dinars, 500 dinars were put in a passport and handed to someone at the MOI who would stamp an exit visa in your passport, which is a crazy thought, but the idea was that you could return legally, as if you had left legally. And then you go down to Ben Gerdan on the border with Libya, and you spend some of that money to buy a hotel, and you pay the rest to a smuggler who smuggles you over the border illegally into Libya. Mustafa was saying, most people from his neighborhood would go then from the border of Libya and Tunisia across Libya to Derna, which for anyone who knows Derna knows it was a hotspot for Libyan recruits, both to Al-Qaeda in the past and to IS after 2013, which was 17 hours by car, and Mustafa was saying that sometimes Tunisian jihadists who were hoping to get to Syria would be waylaid by various militias across the Libyan desert and just shot and left in the desert. So there's a whole bunch of people who tried to get to Syria who couldn't, and Mustafa was one of them. He was stopped at the border. But when I asked him how many people he knew who went to Syria successfully, he said about 30 of his friends. So this is what I mean by hubs. I mean, this is an entire network of friends and family who are involved in this process. And so the paper talks about how the hub formed and what it means. The reason why I think, these are my three takeaways. First, I think Mustafa came from a hub, and the reason why I think these are important is because they send, firstly, disproportionate numbers of fighters to Syria. So my calculations are about 50%, about half of the foreign fighters to IS came from places that are hubs. Hubs are places with at least double the number of foreign fighters who were mobilized to IS than would be normally predicted by the population. Hubs, I think, are also really important because they expand the reasons why someone would join. We're not just talking about people who are ideologues or people who are curious about the movement, who explore information online. We're talking about people who joined, like Mustafa, in large part because his friends and family were going. And for him to stay home was almost more radical than for him to go and join them. But also people joined in Tunis in this hub for protection from the police. They joined for power. That was a really, the neighborhood was run by this group, and so this was a way of accessing socioeconomic mobility and power. And there was a virality to it. But I want to emphasize that, even though people joined for all these other reasons, the indoctrination process was profound and would result in people being just as sort of ideologically committed to the cause as someone who joined for those reasons in the first place. The second point is Mustafa's social network was reshaped deliberately once he was in the movement to make his radicalization seem completely normal. And we can talk about what that means more if you're interested. Third and finally, there's a lot of literature in academic literature on strong ties, which are sort of these connections we have to people who are close friends and family, how important strong ties are for why people join protest movements. And the reason why those strong ties are important, in part, is because they enforce norms of reciprocity. So if you do something for me, because I know you so well and we're so close, it's expected that I will do something for you. And so these norms of reciprocity meant for Mustafa, his family was involved in this movement. It was sort of expected that he would help them out, at least, if not actually actively participate in the group. But strong ties in some of the literature and academic discourse are described as things that come out of strong communities. Strong communities have strong ties. But what I learned about this hub is that, and a lot of other hubs like it, in Lebanon, in Morocco, in other places, even in the Emirates, is that these strong ties aren't formed because the communities are strong. They're formed because the communities are isolated. And I think that's really, really important. I think it's one of the things that distinguishes how hubs form. There's a lot of difficulties of causality associated with that. We can get into that if that's something you're curious about. But these communities are very isolated. And most of this community, where I would walk around in the day, it would take hours to get from there to anywhere else. It was impossible to find a taxi. It was impossible even to go down the main streets, because even the main streets in this very densely populated, poorly planned sort of suburb of Tunis were too narrow for commerce. And so people would commute for hours, and the sort of feeling of isolation was so strong that the community was really just on it, felt like it was completely on its own, but lacked the resources to do anything meaningful or to provide socioeconomic opportunities for the young people there. So I'll end there, but there's lots we could talk about. Thanks.
So my name is Jessica Darden. I'm a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and at American University, and my research is global in scope. So a lot of the experts that we have at the table today are in the field working in particular localities, understanding the social and political dynamics of those particular places. My approach is somewhat different. I focus on global interventions to deal with violent extremism and prevent terrorism. And in doing so, I draw on all of these different lessons and knowledge that we draw from particular localities to try and develop programs, trying to develop a broader understanding of how the U.S. government and other state actors can intervene in these contexts. So what I think is really interesting is that there are very clear patterns that emerge, but that they manifest themselves differently in local contexts. So this summer, I spent time in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo and Albania looking at radicalization and recruitment to ISIS within those countries. And we see very similar patterns to what Mr. Rosenblatt just described in terms of this particular community in Tunis. In the case of Kosovo, we had a lot of recruitment that was occurring on the border with North Macedonia and the border with Albania. We saw cross-border imams coming in from those countries, having underground mosques operating, and really providing a kind of charismatic message. But at the same time, they tapped into the isolation of those communities and the lack of broader civic and social engagement that those populations faced. And so even though we're talking about radically different contexts politically, socially, culturally, we can really identify some of these commonalities. And while any intervention that takes place needs to understand the local context and local social dynamics, we also need to see kind of the broader picture of how recruitment and radicalization happens. So my work is really focused on how development assistance can be leveraged to assist in this effort. And so some of the work that I've done most recently has tried to come up with a more rational U.S. government approach to this issue. The United States has long been involved in using development assistance and other foreign assistance tools to deal with counterterrorism, most prominently in Iraq, where the Commander's Emergency Response Program seized Iraqi government assets and redistributed them to the people of Iraq as part of our post-conflict reconstruction efforts. That was later expanded into U.S. foreign assistance as well. Currently, we fund, through the State Department and through USAID, a broad umbrella of programs that kind of get lumped under the title of countering violent extremism, or more recently, terrorism prevention. And these look very different in different countries. So for instance, in Tunisia, USAID has funded youth poetry slam, rap contests, graffiti art contests that have tried to take urban youth in Tunis and have them kind of engage in more productive social messaging and have a sense that they're part of some broader urban culture. In other contexts, countering violent extremism work can look like girls' education programs in Somalia, where USAID is supporting young women's education as part of a broader effort to ensure that young women and women have a place in that society and that their voices are heard, that they're not marginalized. At the same time, the objectives of these programs are often vague, and their impact goes unmeasured. So the bulk of my work is really spent assessing what exactly it is we're trying to do with our foreign assistance efforts. And ultimately, my conclusion is that not all foreign assistance can or should be related to counterterrorism and violence prevention, right? We do amazing work in the field of global public health that has very little impact on conflict-related outcomes, although it certainly can have, as the current violence associated with the current Ebola outbreak is demonstrating. But some of our work is done for objectives that have nothing to do with U.S. national security, and that is good, and that is okay. But for the work that we do believe supports our U.S. national security objectives, we need to focus more readily on moving the dial in terms of popular support for political violence in a broad range of countries. In some contexts, that looks like atrocity prevention. In others, it looks like terrorism prevention. And we need to be more explicit about how our programs tie directly to political violence. We also need to acknowledge that there are some necessary preconditions for success, right? We can't just drop a bunch of foreign assistance dollars in an active war zone and expect that this magically will have some impact on the dynamics of conflict there. We need to understand that a certain level of security needs to exist and that there are political preconditions that need to exist for the success of civilian actors to operate on these issues. So, for instance, the Office of Transition Initiatives in USAID was operating a program in Mali to support Mali's government and ensure that sustainable progress was brought about in the country's political transition. Well, midway through that program, we saw a huge uptick in violence in northern Mali as a result of increased Islamist mobilization and infiltration by groups associated with ISIS. It is completely unreasonable to expect that our programs would be able to continue operating in the same manner in such a radically changed security context. So I think we need to be a little bit humble about our expectations and about what we're able to achieve in these very, very dynamic environments. I also think that we need to really clearly define our goals and what success looks like in terms of countering violent extremism and preventing terrorism. And that is going to vary contextually, right? So in the case of a suburb of Tunis, maybe that means that we're able to redirect youth and young people who are looking for this kind of sense of belonging away from radical elements, right? But in other contexts, it really means that we want to affect kind of local social values and attitudes about interreligious engagement, right? About interethnic engagement. And so we need to clearly identify what those are in each context. But most importantly, we need to realize that security can and should be our priority, right? Without a foundation of security, we can't operate counter-radicalization, counter-extremism programs in the way that we would like to do. And so security assistance and security cooperation is going to remain a fundamental pillar of U.S. engagement around these issues. And we need to recognize that that can have positive and negative effects. My colleague at AEI, Emily Estelle, did a really good job of mapping out the effect of security assistance in Burkina Faso and how that actually led to increased violence by security forces and actually helped hinder our efforts towards countering radicalization in that context. And so we need to know that all of the tools that we use, right, whether they are associated with the security sector or are strictly civilian efforts, can have unintended consequences. And so we need to rigorously monitor all of our efforts. We need to know what effects are anticipated. We need to understand the realm of impact that is unanticipated and plan for those eventualities. But we also need to respond to need. And so much of the radicalization and recruitment and the political and social instability that we see results from competition over resources. And in many of the conflict-affected environments that my colleagues work in, humanitarian assistance and other soft power tools remain a key asset. Okay? What does this mean? It means that when individuals are placed in a situation where they need to seek resources and protection from a government that is failing to provide, from radicalized groups that promise resources and promise security, right? Or from self-organized protection or civilian protection units, those individuals are making a choice about where their interests will best be served. And actors like the United States can come in and provide resources such as humanitarian assistance, such as security sector programming that can tip the balance between those actors, right? So we're not going to be able to dissuade every individual from aligning with a violent extremist group or with a community-based protection unit, but we can come in and say, look, there are alternative sources of resources, there are alternative sources of security, and we're going to do our best to make sure that we're providing for your needs. We also need to work much, much more deeply with partner countries and with civil society to improve governance, because so much of the mobilization that has happened recently has really occurred in areas where the state's reach cannot be felt. And we often think of these regions as very peripheral, right? On a country's borders, in a geographically isolated area. But we can see how even in areas very close to a capital, right? In almost metropolitan areas, in suburbs and exurbs, the state's reach can really be impeded. So in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, very similar to what Mr. Rosenblatt just described, we have radicalized communities that are completely able to push out the state, right? That resort to their own education system, that do not send their children to the state-sponsored schools, that are able to monitor traffic in and out of their communities, that have individuals, who are responsible for taking on those tasks. And if we allow spaces like that to open up, where the state's reach is limited, where the integration of those communities into the broader society can be constricted, then we're really creating these hubs for radicalization and recruitment. And so we need to be much more intentional about how we support our partners' efforts in governance, but also to ensure that the governance that we do support represents those communities, right? We don't want to create situations where the intentional marginalization or the intentional exclusion of certain communities is being fostered by national governments. And unfortunately, I believe that is so much the source of our current challenges, that we see across the globe push towards more exclusionary governance. And this is something that we can actively push back on in terms of the distribution of our foreign assistance resources. And lastly, I'd just like to say that we think of kind of countering violent extremism in terms of, predominantly in terms of Islamist populations, and I think that is what the majority of today's discussion will be about. But in the areas where I've done a lot of work, we're not just talking about Islamist populations that are seeing a rise in radicalization. We're also seeing this in terms of Pravoslavny nationalism, so Eastern Orthodox nationalism in the Balkans and in Ukraine and in Russia. We're also seeing a push towards kind of alternative conceptualizations of nationhood that are very, very exclusionary. And so I think when we think of what violent extremism means, we need to be more attuned to the variety of forms that that can take, with the recognition that the same patterns and processes can underlie those very different manifestations.
All right. Thanks for having me, Program on Extremism. So I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to respond to a few things from Nate's comments, since I do have a book on the history of Tunisian jihadism. So if you are interested, you can find it on Amazon for pre-order. And then the second thing is I'm going to briefly shift to some stuff related to Al-Qaeda in Syria. So in terms of the thing about them taking over mosques, one of the interesting things and dynamics that also happened, because I was in Tunisia in 2012 and 13 doing field research there, so they also built new mosques as well. So they had their own in-house mosques, and of course the economic situation in Tunisia wasn't good in 2011 after the revolution. It remains the case. So this also helped with some of the linkages built between sort of Ansar al-Sharia and some of the individual wealth financiers, since some of the Dawah literature and educational materials that they used in outreach and different courses they had came from these 3 different bookshops in Saudi Arabia as well. In terms of the comments that you had with, I think his name was Mustafa, correct? In that, the number of people going to Syria peaked in the spring of 2014, in my opinion, based off of research I've done as well. And part of that is mostly because of the efforts by the Tunisian government to finally crack down on the movement itself. In the intervening few years, they pretty much didn't do anything, and their main point was, we can't do anything about people traveling, since most people, well, some of them did go through Libya to then get into Turkey to Syria. Some of them flew straight to Turkey from Tunisia, and that they couldn't impede this. And one of the interesting things in terms of the roles Tunisians played within the jihadi movement, between what they're doing with Ansar al-Sharia, which was a lot dawah activities, educational activities, social service activities, is that it's no surprise then that they are some of the key players in building up the Islamic State's program related to all those types of functions within Iraq and Syria as well. And there's this interesting quote that this one guy that I spoke to that was a member of Ansar al-Sharia noted, and this is before things really blew up with ISIS, is that he mentioned that while the dawah work starts in Tunisia, after things end in Tunisia, because many of them anticipated that there would eventually be a crackdown, is that it would be global in nature, and of course one of the main hotspots would be Syria. In terms of Khatib al-Idrisi, just as context, he's probably one of the main clerical symbols within the Tunisian jihadi movement. He was educated in Saudi Arabia and therefore had a lot of bona fides when he came back in the mid-1990s. And he helped build up some of the early networks in Tunisia prior to the revolution, and he helped pen a fatwa that justified this insurgent activity that happened in December 2006. And he was sort of a key node in the early days after the revolution between the organization itself and him as sort of this guidance individual within the movement. So moving on from sort of the Tunisian context into Syria, one of the interesting things for me is that although obviously the spotlight's been put on the Islamic State, and although Al-Qaeda's had its stumbles in Syria insofar as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham sort of distancing themselves from it, there has been a new group that has sprung up in Syria a little less than 2 years ago now, in February 2018, called Huras ad-Din, or the Guardians of Religion. And this in many ways can be described as sort of the main branch of Al-Qaeda in Syria these days. And it's interesting because nobody really is talking about it, nobody's really writing about it, and there's not that much attention on it. So I think it's important to maybe just have some baseline thoughts on what they're actually doing, since much of the discussion is usually them having these online spats with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham over small tactical and strategic issues. So one of the things, broadly speaking, that I think we should be thinking about is that we've seen sort of the fall of IS. Of course, those within the movement and still believe don't see it as a failure, but some within the broader global jihadi movement might have second thoughts in relation to this. And then you also have the HTS model, which is really building local roots within the community, not focusing as much on the global scene. They're not having as many issues working with countries like Turkey, even though they don't necessarily talk about it as much publicly. Whereas Huras ad-Din could provide sort of this middle ground, especially if we see a further incursion by the Assad regime and the various Shia militias and the Iranian proxies there, which could hurt sort of the ability for them to operate there. And therefore, it's quite possible that Huras ad-Din could be well placed to take advantage of both the fall of IS's territorial control in Iraq and Syria, as well as the potential for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to sort of not being in control of parts of Idlib province as these larger incursions occur. So one of the things to note is that the group itself, at least based off of what we know publicly, is that there are at least 16 subunits within the organization itself in terms of fighting forces. And one of the other things that I think it's important to come to grips is that although we have, people have been studying this for a while, your Bin Ladens, your Abu Yahya al-Libis, your Atiyatollah Abdul Rahman al-Libi, and other individuals like that, but those are the leaders of the past. We need to better have an idea of the leaders going on now. So you have Khalid al-Aruri, you have Samir Hijazi, you have Sami al-Uraydi, Bilal Khurisat, as well as a number of other individuals that are leaders in this organization. These are the names we need to be focusing on now because this is what the movement is. And the reality is that while there still is a movement in the AFPAC region, the epicenter of much of the global jihadi movement today is in Syria and remains so, even if it's not as vibrant, for a lack of a better term, as it was maybe a few years ago. Another thing to note about Huras ad-Din is that they have these two different alliances going on. One is with Ansar al-Tawheed, which is sort of a more extreme version, sort of in between Huras ad-Din and the Islamic State, and they call it Hilf Nusrat al-Islam. And then they are part of this operations room called End in Sight, the Believers, with two Al-Qaeda related groups, Jabhat Ansar al-Din and Jamaat Ansar al-Islam. based off of claims of responsibility. So of course it's hard to know specifically if they did every single thing, and I'm sure there have been attacks that have occurred that they might not have claimed for a variety of reasons. Since February 2018, they've done about 175 or so attacks. Interesting, considering the fact that there's not that much news about them. They also have a robust military training camp system where they have 4 different training camps, at least, that they've talked about publicly. One is the Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib one is Sheikh Abu Islam al-Diri, one is Sheikh Abu Faras al-Suri, and the other one is the Sud al-Tawheed. Besides the military aspects, and for me this is more interesting from my own perspective as a researcher, is that they've also built up their own dawah program within different parts of Idlib province. It's called Markaz Duat al-Tawheed al-Dawa'i, and their main slogan is Tawheed first, and always meaning essentially the unicity of God first. One of the interesting things too, besides the leaders that I was talking about, is that you have this new crop of ideologues in the movement as well. So you have individuals like Abu Usama al-Shawkani, you have Abu Huraira al-Shami, and then interestingly enough, from my end, is that there's actually a Tunisian involved, Abu al-Bara al-Muhajir. And so the different types of activities they do is they do a normal Friday sermon, they do lectures for different younger individuals, anywhere from the ages of like 3, 4, 5, 6, sort of kindergarten-ish, pre-kindergarten, all the way up to teenagers, as well as adults. They have these public dawah forums where anybody is invited. So the individuals might not necessarily be a member of the movement or the group, but they might be just curious about it and piquing interest. And that's one of the things that's interesting too in relation to Ansar al-Sharia back in Tunisia, is that you had a number of people that weren't necessarily a member of the group, but you had people in the community that would still attend these types of events and still be influenced by them on some level. You also have Hurasadin doing cultural courses. They're not very specific on what that means in particular, but that's what they call them. They also are visiting people in hospitals, providing presents to them and train them up, as well as proselytizing their ideas. The thing to note here is that they've had up to around 100 or so of these events over the last, 18 months or so. In addition to the dawah aspect, although they don't have the same level of strength as Hayat Tahrir Hashem in the region, they do have a committee for commanding right and forbidding wrong, essentially doing different types of Hizbah patrol, which is moral policing. And one of the projects that they've done is distributing so-called Sharia-compliant dress to schoolgirls. In addition to that, they've also been involved in some financing campaigns online called Jahizuna, and they're essentially asking people for money so that they can buy more weapons, whether it's AK-47s, bullets, RPGs, and rifles, suggesting that while they might have some source of local funding, they also need some funding from people outside of this. So to sort of conclude from this sort of really baseline look at the organization, and this is one of the things I'm hopefully going to be looking at now that I'm done with my book, is a deeper study on the group itself and what they're up to, is that they have the potential to break out because of the limitations of what ISIS did and the potential for HTS to have issues with the Assad regime, but there are all certain limitations to what they can do as well. And this has been an issue for Al-Qaeda in general, is that once they build up enough support and it becomes a bit more mass, they function as a clandestine organization, and therefore that creates problems because they don't want to go back on some of the ideological points, and that's part of the reason why HTS sort of broke with Al-Qaeda in the first place, is that they didn't want to be sort of held back by that. They wanted to continue to grow. So even if Hurasadin is able to grow, that will be one of the questions going forward, is if they can break out of the mold that we've seen with other Al-Qaeda-related groups when they've been able to do some levels of social services, some levels of governance, dawah type of activities. And then you also have the fact that, at least based off of U.S. government reports, that the group is interested in planning and conducting external operations from Syria into Western countries, whether the U.S. or Europe. And as we saw a few weeks ago with the killing of Abu Khalid al-Muhandis, is that whenever there's some sign that they might be doing something, the U.S. is willing to do conducting airstrikes or maybe even drone strikes in the future in the same way we've seen in other theaters. So while they have built up some local milieu in the areas of Idlib in different cities and towns, they're still not as strong as HTS, and there are potential limitations. But it is interesting just because it is Al-Qaeda's official branch in Syria, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to cover ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and basically this part of the discussion goes back into what the previous discussant have presented. So I'll start with Iraq. In Iraq, ISIS solidified its insurgent capabilities. The Iraqi special forces have limited capability in sustaining long-term operations, which allow the group to exploit vulnerabilities in rural Sunni communities. Also, is still able to conduct asymmetric operations and exploit tension between Sunni and Shia communities. Its support base still concentrated in northern and western parts of Iraq. Given the tension between the Iraqi central government and the Kurdistan regional government and the swath of land contested by both sides, ISIS is still able to reorganize and coordinate attacks from that region. There has not been an agreement on conducting counter-terrorism operation between the Iraqi special forces and the Kurdish special forces Peshmerga. Add to that the tension, the recent tension with Iran in the last few months, and the reduction in non-emergency personnel, which led basically to the reduction in the State Department portfolio regarding Iraq to 4 main items, which is defeating ISIS, supporting minorities, carrying out diplomatic operations, and countering Iran malign activities. There's been a reduction from 563 to around 312, and those personnel are under Chief of Mission in Iraq, and they are central because they are tasked with many of them are tasked with stabilization mission, which is really important at this stage. In Syria, the situation is a bit different, but it is noteworthy that ISIS managed to establish a stable command and control and logistic node in Iraq. This is allowing it to carry out and coordinate operations. We heard in the recent Baghdad speech him bragging about three centrally planned and coordinated operations, large operations for that matter, where attacks, I think, account to 200-something attacks, and that's since they've been defeated. And these attacks are global. They're in DRC, they're in Mali, they're in Syria, they're in Iraq. In Syria, the situation is a bit different, where ISIS is still transitioning from a territory hold forces to an insurgency. It activated its sleeper cells. Unlike in Iraq, it tried to exploit security vulnerability by carrying out attacks to create turmoil in areas clear of ISIS, basically. And by doing so, try to reassert itself. They're also exploiting escalating tension between the Kurdish forces, the SDF, and the Arab population, specifically in Deir Zur province, where locals have protested against SDF practices. And basically, Iran, Syria, the Syrian regime, the Russians are all aware of this, including ISIS for that matter. And they're trying to leverage that kind of tension between the Arabs and Kurds to kind of project or frame the SDF as a new occupying force. And this would ultimately alter the effectiveness of counter-terrorism operation against ISIS. Also, the humanitarian situation at the whole camp is raising a lot of flags, especially because according to Operation Inherent Resolve, it relies on third-party reports. That's really bad. The camp hosts 70,000 IDPs, roughly 50,000 of whom are children. And after the defeat of ISIS in Baghuz, the families of ISIS members many of them, thousands of them actually, were relocated to this camp. We heard a lot about the camp in the recent Baghdadi speech, and we heard a lot of concern from Central Command regarding the potential of ISIS engaging the population of the camp to increase recruitment. There's been a talk about moving Iraqis and some foreign fighters to Iraqi detentions. However, the State Department has been a bit concerned about the due process in Iraq, and also there have been reports about the Iraqi Special Forces misconduct. I think it was USAID and the State Department received a report of sexual and financial exploitation of IDPs in Iraq and people mobilization forces trying to limit the movement of minority and Sunni communities and altering the potential of them going back to their own communities. So with that, I'll end then.
Excellent. Well, thank you, and please thank the speakers for those opening remarks. What I'd like to do is maybe if we could just abandon the microphones for we have 25 minutes left, and just open up to more of a conversation with the panelists and the audience. I thought that I'd kind of start off this conversation with a question towards Nate. You spoke about these demonstrations of commitment and how they were not only kind of like these personal expressions, but they were also occurring obviously within a social context. They were kind of like socially oriented kind of behaviours. Could you talk a bit more about those dynamics, particularly in relation to this idea of norm reciprocity? And you spoke about this idea of almost there being this virality to it. They're kind of a bit like there's viral kind of spread to it, and it was a way of demonstrating that you were that not only that you were committed to the cause, but perhaps certainly in a dynamic that I saw in kind of like counter-terrorism work, where you saw a dynamic where individuals would kind of almost try to out-commit each other, you know, and the effect that had on the group dynamic.
Do you want me to say that now, or do you want to?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Speak about that.
Sure. Thanks a lot. I mean, I think in terms of the commitment signals and norms of reciprocity, I mean, this is really actually very similar to the way gangs recruit, and even in the way that ultimately you participate and become committed. I mean, a lot of the times guys I was talking to were being involved, and they did a lot of securing of communities and social services, but I felt like all of that was mainly oriented towards keeping the group close together and giving them activities to do. Like when I would talk to the community, like citizens in these neighborhoods, like very few of them remembered any of the social services these groups provided. But when I actually asked the members of the group, they remembered it really vividly. Like it was very, very meaningful for them. They felt that they had had a chance to contribute to the community in a way they had never done before. And so people really enjoyed it. On the harder edge side, though, you know, there was a lot of criminality in the group, and they operated like an organized criminal group in some respects. They took over a lot of smuggling networks and a lot of black and gray markets. And a lot of times members of the group were forced to commit a crime as a way of committing themselves to the group, because once you put yourself out there in that way, you needed the group to protect you. And so in order to continue to receive those benefits, sometimes it was protection, sometimes it was other kinds of benefits, you had to keep showing up and keep participating in that way.
There's similar kind of dynamic you see in, for example, through Sulu with drug use in Mindanao. You know, where we're taking the shabu, and then there's this physical kind of addiction that emerges, but it's also a way of keeping people within the group. Similar dynamic in the Balkans, like with the work that your kind of field research, with those hubs of recruitment and those interactions.
So I think one important element to draw attention to is that the way individuals were recruited, particularly into ISIS, varied significantly cross-nationally. So, for instance, in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was entire families that relocated, multi-generational family units. So we had grandparents, parents, and children who sold all of the property that they owned in order to finance their trip to Syria. And these were groups that were never going to come back to Bosnia, right? Like, they were making hijra, they were doing it, they were going to be in Syria for the rest of their lives. And that dynamic is very, very different than the kind of young male who didn't have many family commitments, who didn't have many social commitments. That is more common to the pattern that we see in the Middle East, although, of course, there's a lot of variation there as well. If we look to Central Asia, the migration patterns to ISIS also vary dramatically, even within that region. So in some countries in Central Asia, it was established labor migrants who would traditionally, go to Russia to participate in a harvest, who were then being redirected through human trafficking networks into Syria. While in other countries, again, we saw these same family dynamics where entire families were mobilizing to move to Iraq and Syria. So I think that what we need to do as individuals who are kind of motivated and interested in understanding and hopefully preventing these future dynamics is to get a better handle on why is it that in some contexts it was young men who were very easily mobilized into what looked like gang-like structures or other similar groups, and in other contexts it was much more linked to patterns of migration or senses of how entire families could relocate. And so I think in my work I try and draw attention to these differences and leverage them for our policy.
Any questions from the floor? Any comments people want to make? Aaron, you named several leaders that you think that the field needs to focus on. Perhaps you could speak, maybe give us who's the top leader that the field should be looking at from your analysis so far?
Khalid al-Aruri is the leader of the group now, so he's one of the main ones. And then one of the top military guys is Abu Hammam al-Shami. And then sort of one of the key ideologues is Sami al-Uraydi, though he's a bit more well-known for those who are more in the weeds on this stuff, but he's become one of the largest voices in this. In terms of the prior question, especially in relation to Tunisia and some of the work I did, one of the strongest narratives or ideological points that were being used to try and recruit people was this idea of that believers are brothers, essentially, that we're in this community together and we're building something greater than ourselves. It's not this individualistic type of framing an idea, but rather this communal idea. And I think that was really strong, especially for people in Tunisia, because many people felt like they're left behind by the state, whether not necessarily purely for economic reasons, but more the fact that Tunisia is a highly educated country, and therefore people had higher expectations what they're going to get once they graduate from college, but then they were disappointed that there wasn't that. And then after the revolution, many people were truly hopeful that things would change, and it's not surprising that one of these hubs is actually Sidi Bouzid, which is where the revolution started in 2011, because there's these expectations and they're unmet. So there's those dynamics as well that drew people to this, because while you have the politicians that were arguing in the capital over what's going to be put in the Constitution, you had Ansar al-Sharia on the ground sort of going from city to city, town to town, and being like, we're here not just talking the talk, we're walking the walk, we're doing this, we're providing with some of these services, we're providing with some of these governance, we're providing with some of these educational courses. And one of the things, too, in relation to the other comment regarding the mosque previously, is that was sort of one of the key mobilizing structures in the movement as well. It wasn't just used for praying or lectures, but it was also the place where they planned a lot of their social service activities, where people would come and box different types of foods or presents or what have you, and therefore it became a center of this community as well.
So we have a question.
Yeah. With the movement of people, when you contrasted single young men with the movement of families, are they moving through different channels? And is one channel more open, one more clandestine? And as they're moving through those channels, can they be intercepted with soft power messages to influence their decisions?
Yes, that's a really fascinating question, and I think it's something that deserves more study, particularly now that we have greater access to the limited records that, for instance, ISIS kept. So one document that was written about in the CTC Sentinel was an ISIS guest house registry, right? And so that provided a kind of insight into the types of people who were flowing through that area. And significantly, all of the entries were written in Cyrillic, right? So the alphabet that's used in Russian and also Serbian and related languages, right? But it was a very clear indicator that we have a very multinational, multi-ethnic population flowing through these ISIS-controlled regions. I think the different ways that we approach interdicting population movements based on whether it is individual young men or family units, absolutely we should have different strategies. In practice, though, I think that in some ways the family units that were interested in making hijab had it somewhat easier, right? Because so much of our profiling is focused on this 20-something, young man, that those individuals actually had an easier route. In the case of the Western Balkans, it's very easy to get to Turkey. It's a very short flight. No one would question that you were taking a holiday in Turkey. That's a completely common thing to do. And then once you're in Turkey, obviously the pathways to Syria are multiple and easy. And so I think we need to look at how we kind of broaden the aperture on the types of individuals that are being recruited and mobilized by these sorts of groups. And a lot of my work has focused particularly on the women of ISIS and understanding variation in their pathways into that group. And also, my colleague mentioned Al-Hol, how we're going to move these women and children out of these groups. And so, for instance, Kosovo in March took back 150, thereabouts, women and children from these IDP camps, and they were very proactive in communicating with the families of those individuals and having those families essentially consent to taking custody of those women who were all immediately placed under house arrest. Bosnia will be very shortly repatriating a higher number of women and children. And their communication with a lot of these local communities has been much, much more strained and much more difficult because of the structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina's governance, where it's multi-tiered and broken across the two federations, but also because there isn't a strong sense of local ownership of these people. It's unclear if they will be returned to families, in part because entire family units went. So there's no clear relative to go to in terms of housing these individuals. There's no property, family property that they could be assigned. And so a lot of those women and children are likely to go into the kind of Bosnian social safety net, which, as you can imagine, is quite frayed and faced with many challenges. And so I think as we understand differences in these migration patterns, we also need to understand differences in the return of these individuals as well.
Asad, can you reflect on some of these counter-strategy options?
Yeah, I want to go back to something Aaron just mentioned. Yes, Harassudin is particularly intriguing group. and there are reasons to be concerned about harassing. Just recently, I think last week, where four of its leaders were listed as terrorists. The first time, which was long. We've been waiting long for this to happen. Anyways, what we know about the leadership and the makeup of the leadership of this group is really concerning. First, this is a group of individuals who thought HTS went soft on realignment, having to deal with Turkey, or they're not open about it, but they oppose this, and they listen to Al-Qaeda ideologues, specifically Al-Maqdisi, and also a number of its leaders, those who were not in Syria at the time of formation of Hotspots, were sent from other theaters. We're talking Afghanistan and Yemen by al-Zawahiri, and other members were involved with the group that was the target of one of the first aerial attacks on Al-Nusra Front, a group that was tasked with Khorasan group was tasked with plotting operation terrorist attacks against the West. So it is interesting, and I think it's important to look at the group and their mode of operation. Going back to Al-Hol camp, I was carrying out field work around the time where ISIS was defeated. So I was lucky to be there at the time. And around that time, some few interesting things that I've seen. Like ISIS was like, amid the loss of territory and all of that, they created this emotional support group only for women, and it's fascinating that the stuff they talk about. In some occasion it escalated to material support. In others it was just an expression of solidarity, and we've seen that recently. Al-Baghdadi devoted a whole section in his recent speech just talking about the humiliation and the injustices of being detained, and incited his followers, in fact, to go after people who are managing these detention facilities, whether it's the investigators or anybody who work there. The situation is quite dire in the camp. We have at least, last time I checked, it was like around over 250 children died within the camp after these people were transformed to the camp. Now, we talk about radicalization, but one of the things that we know about radicalization is that shared experiences, especially traumatic experiences, combined with sacred value and ideology, kind of like is a recipe for becoming an extremist. And there is no, I'm not convinced that some intervention would erase these kind of memories. Sometimes memories are so profound that you can't just take them away. And you can't be convinced that there is an alternative universe where you didn't endure these kind of things. And we're talking about like approximately 50,000 children. I mean, we can talk about ISIS members all day long and know what should happen to them, but children have little to no agency when it comes to these issues. I just want to circle back to one thing. Yeah. Regarding ISIS mode of operation in Syria and Iraq, the quarterly report of Inherent Resolve stated that they actually established a strong command and control and logistic node. And Al-Baghdadi mentioned four basic functions that the organization should be focused on. In my data collection, it was clear that they were transitioning toward that. That is an insurgency inclusive of a strong media department, a strong intelligence and security department, and at the heart of it, a strong dawah campaign that has to be multinational, that has to be centrally coordinated. And the military, of course, you can't sustain yourself as an insurgency without having that. And I believe that we have to look and engage in the field to figure out how do they transition, how can we understand that process, and what are the vulnerabilities of this organizational restructuring. I mean, obviously there will be some way of communication between the top leadership and the middle line to coordinate attacks.
We have a question at the back.
Yes, I'm interested in terms of sort of the prevention piece of recruitment. It was very interesting to hear about Mustafa and the way perhaps he was recruited from disenchantment and perhaps a bit more ideology was coming with social norm. But if you look at sort of prevention in terms of sort of government support, there's a piece across from peace building and support from water or electricity or whatever to do there. There's a piece about security there. There's a piece about the state and how the state is not helping or supporting that particular network. I was wondering, sort of how local do you think we would need to go as a sort of a government to support and to make a difference, rather than these huge big schemes where governments can come up with, to how local and how sort of these schemes could go, okay, to that piece or to that tribal area or to it. How do you feel that could be improved?
Thanks a lot for your question. I think it's a great question. I think a lot of what governments ought to be doing should not be framed at all as countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism, or counter-terrorism, or any of that. I mean, in the hubs where I was looking, even there, with Mustafa and his interconnected network of 30 friends who went to Syria and others who wanted to go, in the neighborhood as a whole, we're talking about 1 in 1,000 people going. 1 in 1,000. So, if we're talking about programs that are preventing violent extremism by encouraging kids to go to school or, helping cohere communities to be more resilient to recruitment, you're talking about millions of dollars of investment for 1 in 1,000. And these communities have these issues that are, the recruitment is a symptom of a much deeper and more profound problem, which I think governments ought to care about. That said, I think when it comes to my experience in evaluating programs that work on preventing extremism, I think the ones that work the best try and focus at the individual level. That's how specific. And I talk a lot about how important networks are for recruitment. I think within the disease is the cure, you could say, because interpersonal networks also can help. My experience is someone almost always knows that someone is being recruited. The problem is we lack the tools and ability to help those people find the help they need for that person they know. And that's true for transnational jihadism, but it's also true for white nationalist violence or any other kind of violent extremist behavior. The mother of the shooter in El Paso went to the police and said she was worried that her son was holding these weapons he shouldn't be holding. The girlfriend of the Dayton shooter said that the guy showed her videos of mass shootings on their first date. I have questions about why she continued to date this person, obviously. But, she said in an interview very candidly, and I admire her for saying it, she said she saw a lot of yellow flags, which in retrospect should have been red. And I think when we think about how to work on this issue, in countries where there isn't active conflict, obviously, I think Assad did a great job of, and Aaron also outlining the dynamics in Syria and Iraq. I'm talking about places where there's at least some degree of institutions and relative peace. Social workers and psychologists can work in this environment. But, in Tunisia, too, I interviewed mothers, and the very rare mother who went to the police and was worried about what her son was doing. And they said, what do you want us to do? He hasn't committed a crime. And so, in the worst case scenario, they would detain that person, which would just accelerate his radicalization for the sense of injustice. You ruined my chance of getting a job because now I'm on your watch list and I haven't done anything wrong. So I think we need to think about, in terms of prevention, giving families tools to report these issues confidentially. One of the best programs that I've encountered is a program in Germany, and they're different in different states, and the way the federal system works in Germany. But there's a hotline that families can call, which is staffed by social workers and psychologists, and they can confidentially report the concerns they have, and that person can hopefully start to help get them help. And even in Tunisia, I mean, the people who I interviewed who ended up staying, but who I met through social workers, these people were referred to social workers because their mothers or cousins or sisters or brothers trusted that social worker to work with this person in confidence. Now, around that intervention needs to be massive investment in the structures of opportunity, which is, I think it's a lot similar to a lot of other places. I mean, you're talking about, structures of opportunities. This is where I think what Dr. Darden is talking about is really critical in terms of investment in economic development as a way of dealing with this issue. But I think the problem is when you think about it as a counterterrorism issue, not only are you really not getting a great bang for your buck, but it's hard to evaluate. Like, how does community resilience lead to preventing terrorism? How do you evaluate that? I mean, you can evaluate the fact that the community is more resilient, hopefully assuming that that community's resilience is going to prevent terrorism recruitment. And not in the paper, but in my other parts of the work in Tunis, what I found was I compared this neighborhood that I wrote about in the paper to another neighborhood in Tunis which shared all the same characteristics virtually as the hub, but had virtually no recruitment. What I found was that community was very resilient, but that resiliency and social coherence was involved in carrying out organized criminal activity. So we might not necessarily think that, social resilience is a great thing, but it might not necessarily lead to positive outcomes for other things. So I think we just need to be really careful about how we do this, which, just to conclude, is why I think it's so important to work at the individual level. Not only can you, when you use it at that specificity, you can force organizations you're granting money to identify individuals that are vulnerable to recruitment rather than going to places where recruitment is happening and working with people who are already predisposed to agree with you. For anything like art basket weaving, art therapy, whatever, you have to identify those vulnerable individuals. And then the best success for how to measure outcomes, and I don't know if Dr. Darden would agree, but is measuring individual psychological change over time. That's the best way to understand whether or not these interventions are working. And if you don't understand whether your intervention is working, you're just going to fail and fail and fail again without ever really learning what you did wrong because you don't have the tools to understand it.
I think so much of our terrorism prevention work internationally and domestically is really predicated on this belief that Mr. Rosenblatt just reiterated that, family members are going to be concerned and report. But what if family members are the ones encouraging you to radicalize? Right? How do you deal with that dynamic when it is family units, when it is entire communities that are radicalizing and that are supportive of engagement in violent extremism? And I think we have not developed a strategy for dealing with those dynamics at all, right? And so, a lot of the interventions that do exist, we've kind of gone through several waves of interventions, but where we are now is that they still predominantly happen in national or provincial capitals, in urban areas, because that's where we have the best access. That they target, individuals who are most likely to participate in a U.S. government-funded activity, which are probably not the people that are being targeted by recruiters. And so, yes, we need to think about how we brand and sell these programs. We need to think about the types of programs that we engage in. But I think the most fundamental decision that we need to make is, can we even access the people that we want to access through this type of programming? Right. And in some circumstances, the answer is really going to be no, we can't. So then what, right? Then we have to invest more heavily in an intelligence-based response and a security sector-based response and shift away from kind of the soft programming. But in some contexts, it is going to be, yes, we just need to work harder. We need to get to more remote areas. We need to develop the capacity of local partners and local civil society. So even though USG folks might not be allowed to travel to those areas, we can have a core set of partners that can. And I think that fundamentally moves us away from the US-based implementing partners that we rely so heavily on to do this kind of work, and towards a better way of building kind of local capacity and local knowledge to engage in this type of programming. But I also think we need to consider, what the relative balance of tools is in any particular context, right? We have partners that we can work with and work through that may have more flexibility than we do. So for instance, in the case of returnees, there are actually pretty strong limits of what the US government can do in working with returnees because of the Patriot Act and associated terrorism financing and material support clauses, right? But we can work through partners such as the United Nations, the International Organization of Migration, to really work with returnees. And so in some ways it requires kind of a more flexible approach over which we may have less control, but they can do the kind of work that needs to be done. And I know we're taking that more flexible approach in many countries, but I think we need to think about how our partners, both internationally and domestically, can kind of support our broader goals, and that it doesn't all need to be, USG directed.
Final remarks, Aaron and Asad?
I don't really have anything to add on that. Okay, I think in conflict zones, sometimes we make these are too complicated of solutions to active conflict zone. In fact, not making a decision sometimes is a good CVE, and making a common sense decision without the complexity of all of that, like introducing a huge population of radicalized people to IDPs is a bad idea. It's just bad idea. It's just simple. It doesn't take much thinking. It's just a mistake. You're taking people who you think will radicalize these individuals and putting them in a place where you lack security. You get your data from a third party. You have no control, and basically you know that the enemy is looking at that place. So I think it's my colleague mentioned that is we need to look at these at theater specific to theaters where insurgents are active, whether we are looking at the community that is stable, and also I believe that we have limited resources, so the amount of extremists on the field outweigh the amount of extremists everywhere else, and to cut the chain is to stop the extremists who are operating from safe havens, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere. They connect with these individuals, they tailor messages that appeal to that kind of population, and it's really hard to find that 1 in 1,000. I mean, you're gonna spend a lot on different programs to find that 1 in 1,000. We already have 1,000 concentrated in one place, so kind of it's a common sense for me.
And to close out today, Matt.
Thanks everyone for interesting questions, and to my fellow co-panelists for joining us. I mean, I just want to close with something Asad said about Al-Hol. Al-Hol is a hub, without question. There are 73 to 75,000 people in that camp, and there are 400 guards. And I think, we talk about narratives. I mean, there's no narrative there that's going to change people's minds. It's a question of power. And the women who run that camp, especially in the foreigners section, where there are about 12,000 of them, basically punish collaborators, even kill them. There was a woman who was found buried underneath her tent. There are tents that get burned. So even if you had a wonderful message about the bright, shiny green grass on the other side of the pasture, it's safer for them to toe the line for ISIS in that camp. And so I think my, takeaway is, on this question of what to do with the 12,000 foreigners and the 25,000 kids under 5, is firstly for the forum is to break it up. I mean, it's a network it's a hub, and we have to start bringing people home. I mean, I think the reason why transnational jihadism is celebrating its 40th birthday this year is because countries consistently refuse to repatriate, prosecute, and reintegrate their civilians. And it will only continue if that's not done. I know there are a lot of legal issues with lack of evidence to convict or lack of laws to prosecute in Sweden. It's not illegal to go to Raqqa, for example, which is why they're calling for an international tribunal, which obviously won't work. So these legal issues, people who bill far greater amount of money an hour should figure out how to do this. As an analyst, I can say the reason this movement persists, and is now the largest mobilization of foreign fighters, basically in recorded history, is because of the consistent unwillingness of countries to bring these people back. There are deeper social issues that are involved in their mobilization, and bringing these people back is a critical way to confront them. I think countries have for too long leveraged their counter-terrorism policy on a narrative that this is so dangerous and so extreme and so scary, that we have to do whatever we need to do to stop it. I mean, there were less than 200 people killed in the United States from Salafi jihadism since 9/11. So you're more likely to be drowned in your bathtub than you are to be killed in a terrorist attack. So we have to make more sense about what this threat is. And I think that conversation can help us have a better understanding of socially what it takes in order to bring these people home and deal with this issue. So I'll just close it with that. We can talk more about that. I have a lot more to say on the soapbox about that. We can talk more about that later. Thank you all very much.
Excellent, thank you. And to close out today, I've got to finish with a plug. Assad's latest paper, 7 Years of Terror. Aaron, do go out and buy this book. Your sons are at your service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad. Jessica has a book coming out, right? Pre-order now, November release, Aiding and Abetting. Yeah. And of course, Nate's paper, there's the reason we had the event today, The Architects of Salvation, How Islamic State Foreign Fighter Recruitment Hubs Emerged in Tunisia. So please thank the panel.